The Kenyan National Treasury has revised the country's national budget upwards by 126.3 billion Kenyan shillings. That is by 3.3%, with Kenya Airways, the petrol subsidy, and payment for COVID-19 vaccines being the key drivers of the rise. Kenya Airways was initially set to receive 53.4 billion Kenyan shillings, with the funds set to be directed towards maintenance of grounded planes, payment of salaries, and settlement of utility bills. However, under the new budget, the national carrier will receive the highest additional bailout funds of 26 billion Kenyan shillings. The budget estimates presented to the National Assembly on Wednesday revealed that an additional 24.9 billion Kenyan shillings had been allotted to the fuel subsidy, 8.5 billion Kenyan shillings channeled to COVID-19 vaccines, while the August general elections received a boost of 9.1 billion Kenyan shillings. The increment widens the budget's deficit to 8.2% from 7.5%, an indication that the government may have to borrow in order to sustain its activities. Our focus today is Kenya's budget deficit in 2022. This is Business Edge. I am Lekan Onabanjo, standing in for Tolulokpe Adelere Balogun. Joining on the show is Lekan Satchu, Africa Geo-economist and macro analyst. He's also the CEO, Reach Management. Good morning, Lekan. Thank you so much for joining us on Business Edge.
Morning, good to see you.
Let's start this way. As Kenya will see spendings on subsidies increase by 108 billion shillings, approximately $950,000. What is the general feeling? What is the general mood with Kenyans as regards this unforeseen upsurge?
So, we're talking about fuel subsidies here. The government introduced a subsidy to cap prices at the pump some months ago. The oil operators are complaining and saying they're not being paid or rebated these subsidies at the moment. The problem is, as you can see from the oil price, which is headed inexorably towards $100 a barrel, that this problem is going to compound. And the Kenya government is a little bit like that Dutch boy sticking his finger in the dike, and you know the flood tide is coming. So it's not a sustainable policy. I think it speaks to the little awareness of how much pressure there is on the cost of living side for the average citizen. This is a typical knee-jerk reaction of which we've seen a lot, and it's highly unfortunate, and it's not sustainable.
Well, it's not easy for the citizens, and I don't think it's easy for the government too, because we have issues with petrol subsidies, building a COVID-19 vaccine plant, and a bailout for Kenya Airways, which is said to be topping the list of sectors to go up additional cash. Now, we have issues with paucity of funds. Which of these three do you think should come first when you're talking about implementation or driving the focus towards? Or do you think the government has the capacity to load on all these three and bring them to bed?
So, the government obviously has been borrowing very, very heavily. And essentially, we came to a crunch type situation, and the IMF and the World Bank to some degree stepped in, reducing some of the borrowing costs that the government was facing. And very much the IMF, in the IMF's case, it appears that they are sitting in the Treasury to some extent in the background and managing the finances. The problem has been that, we've seen this train coming at us in the tunnel. It's just simply gaining speed. And these are, palliative reactions to what is a very, very difficult situation. The government has overspent. It's made investments which are simply not paying off. The pressure is now being put on the citizen, And then these reactions that we're seeing of subsidies are very short-term, knee-jerk political reactions with very little economic sense behind them. The challenges that you mentioned, for example, Kenya Airways. Kenya Airways has been unprofitable since 2013. It's unable to make money. The latest proposal was to merge it with another failing African airline, South African Airways. If you could not think of the most suboptimal solution for the problem, that was probably it, to merge two losers to create an even bigger loser. The problem with Kenya Airways, of course, was compounded by COVID, but it's basically and fundamentally mismanaged. The balance sheet is blown to bits. So the question is, if you want to play at that level, you've got to restructure that balance sheet. And the government just continues throwing money at the problem without resolving it. So a very challenging situation. Talking about more borrowing, at the moment, as you know, external markets are not friendly towards Africa. Ghana is a recent example of a country which has been shut off. So, and if you go to the external markets, even with the IMF support, it's going to be very expensive. So we can imagine more borrowing is going to come domestically, and that's going to crowd out people even further. I mean, this morning or yesterday, a couple of days back, we saw the latest IHS market report, which was at 47.1, lowest for many months, and signaling the economy is in contraction. So lots of challenges. The supplementary budget is, it's a political thing. I don't see any grown-up thinking going on here at the moment. I just see policy-making reactions, and an environment where we've got politics front and center, and a very little adult thinking.
So invariably, are you saying there's no solution to the issue of the Kenya Airways, because it's one of the airline is said to be the continent's most notable flyer, and of course, the government has 48% stake in that airline. So is it that there's nothing that can be done by the government to see that this airline makes more revenue and becomes viable in terms of business propositions?
So in terms of a business proposition, the successful pivot to cargo seems to have saved Ethiopian Airlines. And obviously that's a current flavor of the month, that people are saying, you can increase revenues and increase the sustainability of the business by looking at cargo more aggressively. I think the other areas are simply that they've got to cut costs, and they've got to cut the routes which are not profitable. And for a long time, they've simply not done that. And then, if you look at the cost of leasing, this has been a boondog for many insiders who lumped enormous leasing costs on the airline, which makes the airline fundamentally unsustainable. So, you've really got to take a knife to costs. You've got to look at a lot of the contracts which were signed, and you've got to work your way through it. But this problem is a multi-billion-dollar problem if you want to resolve it. I mean, the famous saying, I think, Warren Buffett, is if you're a billionaire and you want to become a millionaire, own an airline. And, this is clearly the case for Kenya Airways. It's entirely unfortunate, because Kenya Airways was one of the first Pan-African and global airlines. It was enormously successful in the years until about 2013. And then things have gone wrong, not unlike what we saw at South African Airlines. A lot of insider dealing, a lot of government interference, and we now find ourselves in a very difficult situation. I think what we're seeing is there are better run airlines in Africa, Ethiopia, one of them, Rwanda with a partnership with Qatar, and they're going to have the lunch of these badly managed quasi-state airlines. And I just don't think it can be resolved.
Well, I'm still particular about the Kenya Airways. Now, a previous plan approved by lawmakers in 2019 to nationalize the airline was jettisoned. so they had to resort to bailouts. Now, that would actually have led to the delisting of the airline from the Nairobi Securities Exchange. Now, which would you say was wiser, the bailout or the fact that they jettisoned the Kenya Airways from the Kenya Airways was the plan to nationalize Kenya Airways was actually jettisoned?
So firstly, as we mentioned, Kenya Airways is suspended from trading at the Nairobi Securities Exchange. It was one of our first IPOs, so there are lots of small shareholders in there. The government will need to consider in any solution how those shareholders are dealt with. So we've had a number of proposals, as you said, the nationalization one. This was because as a standalone entity, Kenya Airways is simply not able to support lease agreements for airplanes. You need a strong balance sheet in order to afford signing those particular leases. So in the interim, what has happened is the airline is leaning on the government's balance sheet, which effectively means it's a backdoor nationalization as we're looking at it. It's just not being called that. I think it came down to a bandwidth issue that the government wasn't able to put enough resource behind finding a solution. Then we went down this wormhole of a possible merger with South African Airways. So I think it needs focus. My solution, look, the airline is a national interest issue, particularly given that we are the transit state, the gateway into East Africa. So we can't afford to lose the airline, but we've got to fundamentally restructure the balance sheet and then turn this airline around so that it's actually making a profit every year. Otherwise, this is becoming a huge millstone around the neck of every citizen.
Well, basically, you're saying a refocusing for the airline, but then we get to look at other areas as regards the budget. You get to stay with us for a while. I will join you in a bit. Now, the overall change in the national government ministerial budget from the originally approved one sees an increase of 126.3 billion shillings, with the budget deficit now 8.1%. Now, does this signal additional borrowing to plug the financial hole, or how will this even impact Kenya's economic recovery drive? We get to know more about this at the other side of this break. Do stay with us. It's still Business Edge. Still with me on Business Edge is Lekan, Satchu, Africa Geo-economist and macro analyst and CEO, Reach Management. We have been considering Kenya's budget deficit for the year 2022. Back to you, Kan. Before the COVID-19 pandemic started, Kenya was on a course to maintain an annual growth rate of 50%, which contracted to 0.3% due to the pandemic. Now, how much of an impact will these subsidy payments have on its economic recovery plan?
So that's an interesting question. I think, obviously, given what happened last year and the slowdown that we encountered, you're going to get a base effect related rebound, which is going to boost the economic GDP rate this year. And it's just a statistical bias. If I'm looking at the economy as a whole, and I just mentioned the IHS market report, which was soft, tourism we should expect to pick up. That's in excess of $1 billion. Agriculture, which is 1/3 of or 1/4 of GDP. A lot will depend on the meteorological outlook for that, but one can expect that to be relatively resilient. So overall, I think, market growth this year, taking into account the statistical thing which I just mentioned, we're looking at around 5.5% to 6%. But the big challenge overhanging these projections, of course, is the election. And historically, we've not managed our elections too well. If you look back at GDP and you just layer on the election year, you'll see that we've had considerable dips because of outcomes at the election time which were not conclusive, and therefore it drags on. And then you've got the other further challenge, which is debt, which is extremely high debt. And you can look at debt to GDP, but you also have to look at your revenues versus the interest that you're paying on your debt. And at the moment, Kenya is spending about 55% of its tax revenues on debt repayments, which is a very high number. As you'd imagine, makes things very difficult. But on the plus side, it's a resilient economy. It's an important economy. I think we've seen all the support from the IMF and the World Bank, particularly given the very difficult situation in a number of neighboring countries like Ethiopia. Overall, look, this year, I think we're going to see 5.5% GDP expansion, in part because of the rebound that I described. But then the question is, after that, what happens? And that will be a very tough challenge. In fact, for the incoming administration, they've got an enormous challenge, and it's an election that it's quite funny. The debate is entirely divorced from the economic reality, it seems, at the moment here.
It's quite difficult, you've said, and people are actually saying maybe there's a leeway in terms of additional borrowing. You've talked about the fact that the debt level is actually on a high side, but then in September 2021, the Kenyan government actually removed subsidies on petrol, but then had to reverse that because people started shouting, oh, the cost of living is quite high. Now, even despite the fact that there's a rise in terms of the debt being paid, do you think or see a possible borrowing, maybe additional borrowings by government in order to live up the budget's deficits?
So the government is in a difficult situation. It has to borrow because its current path is not sustainable. And in order to meet the budget differential, they will be definitely borrowing. And they'll probably, as you've noticed, because of the supplementary budget, be borrowing more than they projected they would be. The question is then, where they're going to borrow from. Look, they're getting support from the IMF, so they can probably go to the Eurobond market with that quasi-IMF support and borrow from there, but it's going to be expensive. We've had a wild week in international bond markets this week. It's going to be more difficult for frontier market and peripheral borrowers going forward. So that's a tough call. But at the moment, they can definitely borrow in the local market where they've been paying double-digit interest rates, and banks have been making enormous profits buying those bonds predominantly. So there is that capacity to do that. But ultimately, they've got to, anyone who's looking at this on a 2-year or 4-year prospect has got to say to themselves, you've got to start cutting costs. It's not sustainable. You can't just tax people anymore. The reaction to that petrol subsidy tells you that everyone's tolerance is practically gone now. So it's a tough time. They're going to continue borrowing, but at the same time they're going to have to cut costs. They haven't made those tough decisions yet because of the election. They don't want to be cutting headcount and reducing spending at this sort of time. But once the election's over, the chickens are going to come home to roost.
Quickly, your thoughts. Why is it that it seems as though running of elections in Nigeria, not only Nigeria, in Africa and Kenya, in different African countries on the continent, why is it that processing an election is quite expensive? Because according to what we have in the budget, 9 billion shillings, which is about $80 million US, is been allocated to the Electoral Commission towards the August election, January election in Kenya. So why is it that expensive?
It's incredible. I mean, when I was looking through the numbers in Kenya, in Nigeria, we in Africa hold probably on a per capita basis the most expensive elections anywhere in the world. It's incredible. And I think, there is very little justification for it. It speaks to the power of the political economy over the real economy and the fact that we're not able, as citizens, to get control and really get value for money out of our elections. It's a great shame. It's completely out of control, not only here, but I saw an estimate from the Nigerian election saying it's, total cost is about $2 billion. It's crazy. And it's very, very unfortunate because I think it makes a kind of circus of the whole thing. We should be able to poll our citizens 50 times in an electoral cycle about all kinds of things in order to get better policy outcomes. But all we do is have this circus every 4 or 5 years. We spend enormous amounts of money. We bribe our citizens with very small bribes when you think about it. And then, and then we have the same issues. We just don't face down the policy challenges that we should be facing down.
Well, let's hope the runners of this government will be able to come together and get their acts right in terms of championing the cause in the business circle and, of course, in other sectors of the economy in Africa. But then thank you so much, Lekan, for joining us on Business Edge.
Thank you.
All right, now, judging by today's discussion, there is no doubt that President Uhuru Kenyatta has a lot on his plate in terms of providing additional cash to fund the budget deficit, lower rising debts, ensuring that all sectors of the economy are running while having to protect Kenyan citizens from the virus and also keep them happy. Well, just like Lekan said, the World Bank and African Union are stepping in at some point, and that might just give a bit of cushioning. We'll quickly run off on this break, and when we return, it will be time for NC4 to watch. Do stay with us. On NC4 to watch, let's tell you that Moody's Corporation announced that it has agreed to acquire a majority 51% stake in Global Credit Rating Company Limited. GCR is a leading credit rating agency in Africa with operations spanning the continent, including in South Africa, Nigeria, Senegal, Kenya, and Mauritius. The Central Bank of Kenya received bids worth 27.8 billion Kenyan shillings at the weekly Treasury bills auction, an oversubscription of 115.82%, and accepted 25.8 billion Kenyan shillings. The most attractive instrument at the auction held on February 3, 2022 was the 364-day Treasury bills, which received bids worth 16.2 billion Kenyan shillings out of the 10 billion Kenyan shillings offered at the auction, a performance rate of 161.68%, with CBK accepting 14.3 billion Kenyan shillings. We also tell you that Shell PLC's sale of a multi-billion-dollar stake in a joint venture that operates oil fields in Nigeria has attracted bids from 4 local companies: Seplat Energy PLC, Sahara Group Limited, Harris Oil and Gas Limited, and ND Western Limited, which submitted the non-bidding offers in January, said the people who asked not to be identified because of the discussions are not public. And finally, oil prices climbed on Friday, extending sharp gains in the previous session as cold weather swept across large swathes of the United States, threatening to further disrupt oil supplies. Brent crude rose 34 cents or 0.4% to $91.45 a barrel by 2:06 GMT after rising $1.16 on Thursday. U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude rose 46 cents or 0.5% to $90.73 per barrel, having gained $2.01 the previous day to settle above $90 for the rest of the first time since October 6, 2014. Both benchmarks are headed for their 7th straight weekly gain. And that's it on today's edition of Business Edge. You can join us on our social media platforms at New Central TV. That is it. And you can also visit our website, www.newcentral.africa. You can also download our mobile app on App Store and Play Store. Until next time, I am Lekan Onabanjo. Have a wonderful weekend.